Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 21. Today, we are talking about fair housing and communication again. This is part two of our two-part series, and we're going to be covering tips for a virtual world. So we're so glad that you're here today. Remember to give us a thumbs up. We appreciate so much your support. And so as we think about tips for a virtual world, we know like the communication that we're involved in spans so many different types of devices and platforms. So we're going to key in on a lot of excellent scenes and get some feedback from our fantastic and awesome co-host, Kathy Williams. Kathy, welcome to the show again.
Hey, Jonathan, good to be here. And we're going to be talking about, yet again, another important topic for our housing community.
Right. Yeah. One of our blog posts was super popular and it was talking about best practices for answering the phone. And so this segment of our YouTube series is really going to dive into all types of communication devices. So we look forward to your feedback, and thank you for being here with us today. So let's get into our first scene. Our first scene really dives into questions about availability. So let's take a look at our scene, everyone, and then Kathy will get your feedback on it.
Hi, I'm looking for an apartment complex that has one-bedroom apartments available. Do you have one-bedroom apartments on your property?
Yes, we do. We have a bunch. If you go on our website, you can see all three layouts of our one-bedroom apartments that we have here. There's the Cascade, the Venetian, and the Boca del Mar. The Venetian is my favorite, but I would live in any of them, honestly. They're all really nice.
You know, a long time ago, Jonathan, I was the director of Atlanta's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And in that position, I saw thousands of fair housing complaints. And I was always amazed by how many of those thousands of complaints were caused by misunderstandings and mistakes, innocent mistakes. And this is just such a good example of one of those, which can be boiled down to the idea of communication and the need for training and communication. This is one topic, though, that nobody can get wrong. Availability is the one, let's say one of the top 4 or 5 factors in the discussions that go on between leasing agents and prospects. And this one has got to be right. Now, why is that? Because in the world of fair housing, we know about testers. And if you give one prospect one piece of information about availability and another one a different information, that can look like a fair housing problem. Now, in this instance, we've got Chris, who's so eager to sell his apartments that before he finds out really what the question is, he is off on his sales talk. And in this instance, it's a problem because think about how upset this caller would be if he left work, jumped in his car, took time off, drove over to this property, and found out that there were no one bedrooms available. Instead, Chris was selling the one bedroom floor plans that he had, not the units that were available. So this miscommunication, this mistake, could end up looking like discrimination if the prospect is a member of a protected category and he's thinking, well, the guy just told me about all these units this morning and now I get here and now there aren't any available. Now, this is the kind of case, if it were filed, that you could win, but you shouldn't ever have this kind of case because you should be very careful when you're communicating over the phone, especially, that you listen before you talk, that you make sure you're responding to the correct question that the caller is intending. And if you're not sure, you double check with them. You say, now, are you asking me this? And then you give them the answer. And you should always mention on these telephone calls issues involving availability and the fact that even what you think is available right now today may not be available later today because things change. That's just the way it works, so that no one's going to misunderstand when that information might change later in that day.
Right.
So again, this is one of those areas where you have to have good training, you have to have good information, and then you've got to do supervision to make sure people are communicating in the way that they should be communicating for your policies.
Right. Right. Very good. Excellent. Yeah. And that's across channels, whether it's the phone, whether it's email, whether it's if you're using some sort of a chat system. The idea is like that you have that right information. And so that communication of what's available should be clearly there. And apparently Chris didn't really read what was available for him before he got on that call. So yeah, very, very good. Awesome. Nice application, so we can see it's not just simply, oh, I didn't know what was available. It could be a potential fair housing violation, and we just want to avoid that as much as possible. Thank you, Kathy. So let's look at our next scene. So this is about screening criteria. And so an employee is answering a call that would involve screening criteria, but has not been trained on it. And instead of maybe looking to someone who has more training or has more experience, they try to handle it on their own. So let's look at our scene and we'll get your feedback and takeaways from that, Kathy.
How much do you have to make to be able to qualify to rent your 3-bedroom apartment?
That is a great question. I'm new here and I'm not super sure, but based on the rent for our 3-bedroom apartments and that most of the time you have to make 3 times the amount of rent, I'd say that you'd have to make about $3,500 a month for a 3-bedroom, but I'm ballparking it.
Well, Jonathan, in the housing industry, there can't be any such thing as ballparking it when you are talking about something that is as important as whether a prospect is going to likely qualify or there's no way they can qualify, especially with something like income. There needs to be consistently applied criteria. And until an employee is sure of what those are and knows how to express those properly, they shouldn't be talking to prospects, not about eligibility criteria. For instance, in this instance, if the proper amount of income that would make someone eligible or ineligible was $3,000 instead of $3,500. Now we're saying that that person who just heard that might be discouraged from applying because of what they were told about their income requirements. Now, if that person is one of the protected categories, it might look like Chris was discouraging them because of that and not because he didn't know enough to communicate the correct eligibility criteria. So there's a couple of problems here. One is Chris's. He should not be spouting off. He's calling it ballparking. I call it shooting from the hip, meaning that you don't know what you're talking about, but you're trying to cover it up by still talking. That is a major problem in the leasing office if we're talking about eligibility. Right. The second problem we've got here is I question that his supervisors threw him out on the floor with no more training and confidence in his ability to properly communicate these things. So there's a couple of problems here, and boy, I think they need to be corrected before someone misunderstands and thinks they're being discriminated against.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. Don't, the takeaway, don't ballpark. Just don't do that. Make sure your employees are well trained so that they don't put themselves in that potential situation. Excellent. Thank you, Kathy. All right. So our third scene involves questions about resident population. So an employee is answering a call about, what's the different religious backgrounds among the population that live at the apartment community. And the employee thinks that they're going to be helpful and tell them all about it. So let's look at our scene and we'll get your takeaways and thoughts on this one, Kathy.
I'm Jewish and I'll be attending the synagogue down the street from you. Are there any other Jewish people living there? Where I live now, there are lots of us from the synagogue and we often get together.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, lots of our residents from the local synagogue get together every Monday night in our clubhouse and play mahjong. They even have tournaments and prizes. I hear it's really fun.
This is such a good example of where Chris thinks he's doing a great job of selling his apartments to that prospect. And instead, what he is doing is walking himself into a pretty serious fair housing violation.
Yep.
The general rule, as I hope everyone knows, is you can't sell your apartments based on who lives there. You've got to sell your apartments on their amenities or their location or lots and lots of other factors, not based on who lives there. Because the minute you do that, you can easily encourage someone because of their protected category or discourage someone because of their protected category. Both are prohibited by the Fair Housing Act. So Chris is jumping on the idea that these prospects are Jewish and they'd like to live in a community with other Jewish people. That is absolutely understandable for the prospect. It is not okay for Chris to give information about the religion of the people who live in that community. Now, Chris would know probably that he shouldn't give that information about the race or maybe how many Hispanics live in that community.
Right.
But remember, religion is the same. It is a protected category. You can't encourage people. You can't discourage people because of their religion. That just is something that has to be communicated over and over again using all kinds of examples so that people hear this when it arises and don't fall into the trap that Chris did. Well-intentioned as he was, it was still probably a violation.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Nicely explained, Kathy. Thank you so much. Sometimes you can get so focused on one protected class that your attention could be deviated for a minute. So it's important to be well trained on all of them. And these scenarios really, I know have helped our audience. And we've covered some really key topics today: availability, screening criteria, and discussing who lives at the property and how you can avoid those potential fair housing violations. But it kind of leads to just an overall question. So we have many communication mediums: phone, social media, email, text. And so any other tips that you can share with the audience, Kathy, when it comes to, best practices in general that would help our audience today?
Jonathan, I think this is kind of about communication. It's also about training.
Right.
And it's also about supervision. So there are some issues, factors that are so important that have to be right every time, that I think it's worthwhile having what I'd think of as a cheat sheet, a dialogue that sits in front of especially new employees for certain questions. And that when they get those questions, rather than just trying to come up with an answer, they look down and literally repeat what's on that cheat sheet. Now, the topics I would think that should be covered in that kind of very specific language would be eligibility criteria. We talked about that earlier. Availability, that maybe can get posted in the office and changed all the time, but it should be there to see, and hopefully not for a leasing professional to try to just remember, because it changes all the time. Another concern I have is answering questions about criminal history screening.
Yep.
And because that is such a hot fair housing topic, I would not leave it up to individual leasing agents to know how to answer that. I would write it down and just have them repeat it. And questions about animals. That is, again, an area that there is so much litigation. And in my experience, a lot of that litigation results from the wrong answer being made in a moment of maybe thoughtlessness, when they're really busy and they just shoot an answer out of their mouth, and they assume that the conversation is about a pet rather than an assistance animal. They don't cover that. So I think that's the kind of thing that needs to be carefully scripted and repeated each and every time, and don't leave individual leasing agents up to coming up with their own answers. So those are some of the topics I think should be scripted and very, very carefully repeated. And there may be others for different properties. Another one that, boy, we're seeing kind of getting more and more fair housing attention is, does your community accept Section 8 housing choice vouchers? Now, that is either a yes or no, and we don't want leasing agents, again, making the wrong answer to that, because in certain areas of the country, that is a protected category source of income. So they should be able to quickly and easily answer that as well. All of this is a matter of training, is a matter of supervision, is a matter of communication.
Right. Very good. Yeah, I love it. And just like thinking it from the whole perspective, you've mentioned training. So there's fair housing training, like what we have are our online courses. There's that in-person webinar type training. And even like these scenarios, this is why we're putting these together for our audience. It's like, okay, here are some common situations you're going to be faced with. But I absolutely love your takeaway there. Have some sort of a cheat sheet, because especially for newer ones in the industry, it can be daunting. Okay, and now I have to answer the phone and I'm sweating profusely because I have all of these potential scenarios that I have to answer correctly. And that can, absolutely be nerve-wracking. And sometimes, as you mentioned, it gets so busy. Is there a moment? And to be able to even ask someone, those are all those scenarios that leadership is taking into account to make sure that their team is well trained and in a position for success. So excellent feedback. Thank you so much, Kathy. So some great takeaways. We thank you, everyone, for being here today for episode 21. This was communication part 2. And we really covered some best practices when dealing with response to questions that come from prospects, and being able to rent apartments on your property. So we thank you so much for being here. Please share this channel with your network, share it with your team. Give us that thumbs up. We appreciate you. Thank you, Kathy, for your insights. We'll see you on our next show. Take care, everyone.